All right, before you turn off the lights though, I'm gonna start with there's a few resources that are awesome. The Rodale Book of Composting is the Bible of composting, and it was written a long time ago, but it's been recently updated. So it's a great book to have, or it's all these books are available through the Monroe County Public Library System. So definitely check that out if you really want to get to know the ins and outs of composting. We're going to talk briefly about vermicomposting, and this is a great book called Worms Eat My Garbage. It's a very lighthearted book. It has great pictures and stuff with smiling worms and whatnot, just to keep you entertained. But it is really easy to read, good book, and helps you with having a vermicomposting system. And then this one, not because she looks like me, was given to me by a fellow master gardener, but a great A to Z children's book. And it's even good for adults because it just is a quick, summary of what you can and can't, and the fun. So it's great to get your, children, grandchildren involved. And again, it's all available at the Monroe County Public Library. So now you can turn off the lights. All right, so my name is Sue Nolan, and I'm a master gardener. I was actually certified and trained in the Houston area, Houston, Texas, through the A&M program. And then I moved back to the area with my husband a few years ago. And I am a advanced trained in composting, whatever that means to anybody, right? I do like to say, and a couple of people already heard this, but I am a master gardener, but I still kill as many plants as I did before, but now I know what to do with them. So that's kind of what, how my mantra starts. So as a society, we do have an envy for green. And right now, of course, we're loving it right after a dull winter where we saw a lot of grass. We didn't see a lot of snow. We want that green. We want those green yards. We want plants, everything doing well. We feel safer. We found out through the pandemic that actually it's better for our mental health if we're surrounded by some green. So this is what we tend to strive for in our spring and summer months. Go ahead. At what cost, right? So, and here, I mean, I'm sure we all come here, you're going to buy your fertilizers, some of your herbicides, all these things, thinking that that's going to make your green lawn better or your yard better. It's interesting that, and this was a survey that included some of the larger states in the country, including New York State, that we buy, spend money on lawn fertilizer. Only 61% of us read labels, which it's better than a lot of things, but it's really important that you read those labels and follow the instructions, because it's one thing that we talk about, more is not better. Okay, so that type of thing. And you may have found that out if you've burned out a spot in your lawn or something, spilled the bag by mistake, things like that. So, but these are all, what we do to try to get there. 77% of us also use herbicides, which, take care of those dandelions, all those things that now we're actually finding out is really important for our pollinators, right? Our early bees need these weeds and these flowers in our lawn to help with pollination. And 1 out of 3 bites of food that you put in your mouth depend on pollinators. So when you think about that, it's like, yeah, we got to make sure we're supporting them. Strangely enough, only 26% of the population that were surveyed conducted soil tests. This is a really important part of understanding what's going on in your yard. It's kind of like, why would you give an antibiotic to someone that has, stubbed their toe and broken it, right? It's the idea that you don't just put this stuff on, understanding that it's going to be the be all end all fix all when you really don't know what the issue is with your yard. So it's really important to consider doing conduct a soil test in your yard. CCE does actually provide soil tests. You also can pick up soil tests that, I'm not sure if CountryMax has it or not, but some areas you can just do your own. But I highly recommend CCE does it for $10. You bring in your sample to the St. Paul Boulevard location. This time of year it gets a little busier, but usually it's a 2-week turnaround, and you'll find out, you'll tell them what you want to grow or where you're having the issue, and they're going to be able to tell you what your pH levels are and make recommendations on what your soil actually needs. Go ahead. On the flip side of it, we got all that grass growing and everything's looking great, and then we collect our grass clippings or we take our yard trimmings and we put them to the curb for somebody to pick up and take care of. Unfortunately, we're finding out that between our food waste, paper waste, which most of us are recycling, right? But the idea that if with food waste and then our yard trimmings, if you add all that together, we've got 43% of what we're putting to the landfill is unnecessarily going there, right? And just because yard trimmings are organic and we think, well, they're still going to just biodegrade there, it isn't. And it gets guilty by association, right? If it's stuck there, it's not going to decompose in a manner that it could, and it adds to the methane release problems that we're having with landfills. So the idea that if we can take 43% out of it and actually use it in our yard, go ahead. We're going to make, we're going to have actually save money and save time, save what the landfills are really need the space that they're used for. So why compost? Urbanization, as we can all see, we're just keep growing, right? And all these people with yards and whatnot, we're doing the same practice. So we need to consider what we can do and hold in our own neighborhood or our own yard. And as gardeners, we are land stewards, right? And we all enjoy gardening, obviously, if you're here. So it's the idea that if we can take care of our yards in a better way, we're going to help the neighborhood and our community. Organic versus synthetic, and there are obviously times when synthetic is necessary for maybe specialized plants or situations, but we're going to find that when we're using compost in an organic scenario, there are actually a lot more benefits than there are to the synthetic. And then if you're not spending your money on the herbicides and pesticides, then you get to spend money on plants. What isn't great about that, right? So composting is easy, and I know people are like, well, I'm a little frustrated here that, but it really is, but it's understanding about the right ingredients, okay? And we're going to talk a lot more about that. Go ahead. So what is compost? So it is different. It's not soil, right? Compost is a dark, crumbly, and earth-smelling form of decomposing organic matter. And I'm going to pass this around. I picked this up today at our CCE facility. You're going to see some bits of vermiculite in here because they did put some potting soil in it, which we will talk about it. But you can see this is what compost is. Feel free to touch it. It's going to be something that you can hold in your hand. It's going to hold together. This might actually be a little dry, but and what it is it's all those things that you put in it that is now unrecognizable, but a very, very nutrient rich food for your soil. This is what compost is. Go ahead. So we use it because it contains nutrients not available in synthetic fertilizers. This is kind of like the well-rounded vitamin, right, for your soil, whereas a synthetic fertilizer might be just like the steroid shot. It gives you the boost quickly, and then it gets, disperses and, gets washed away in watershed. So it's contains a lot of the higher nutrients. It releases them a lot more slowly, which is good. So it's kind of a steady release of nutrients for your soil. It is a great neutralizer. So it's going to take the pH of your soil, which for a prime range for growing most of your plants and shrubs and trees, and is within that 5 to 7 range of your pH. So what's great about compost is when you add that and amended your soil with that, it's going to bring that soil into that 5 to 7 range. It's a great neutralizer for that. And because it's slow releasing, it's not going to run off as quickly as your synthetic. Go ahead. It also, because it's a great equalizer in that if you have clay soil, you add compost to the soil, that's going to help feed the microorganisms that are in the soil. And soil, if you're amending it, adding it in. On the flip side, if you have sandy soil, it's going to bond with those minerals and soil, not minerals, but the soil components, your little rocks and granules, and that is going to bond with that, and it's going to help the sandy soil retain water. Okay, so again, it's a great equalizer in that it kind of brings the soil into a healthier balance. And because of that, it can quadruple your soil's water holding capacity. And again, with the altering the soil structure, it's going to help with erosion. And again, we're back to, if you're treating your soil with this healthy diet of compost, it's like us. If we have a healthy diet and we're not stressed, we're going to suppress the diseases and pests that often attack plants when they're under stress, right? So it's a great way to help the earth. In our hands, people. That's my preachy point. Now we're going on. So now we're going to go to Science 101 or Earth Science 101. Mother Nature's been doing this for years, right? Eons, really, not just years. So you take your leaves that fall off a tree. They're going to be munged on by animals, birds, and then their waste is then left on the soil. Other smaller microbes and microorganisms are going to feed off that. It gets absorbed into the soil, and your worms and all your smaller microorganisms are going to process it. Then that helps promote the nutrients that then are absorbed back through the roots and promotes the tree growth for leaves for the next year, right? So, if you walk, we have great hiking trails in Syria, you see it all the time. The leaves fall, no one's blowing them away. They're sitting there by next spring. And now with all of your new growth coming up, those leaves disappear and they're composting and feeding the soil and helping everything happen naturally. Go ahead. A little more specifically, here you've got all those little critters starting with your animals, right? And then their waste is processed and brought down into the root systems through your organic matter and then absorbed through the roots. Okay, so that's what's been happening naturally. Go ahead. What we're going to do is we're going to take what Mother Nature has exemplified and we're going to try to do it in a controlled setting. And that's what we're really trying to do in our backyard, right? Hopefully not taking as long because we are impatient people. But the idea that we are going to take care of that in a controlled setting. So it's understanding how to get the prime ingredients and the ratios together so you can do that. So what to compost? So yeah, kitchen scraps, obvious, okay? All of your salad trimmings, fruit and vegetable peels. One thing I would caution is you want to avoid in a backyard scenario, you don't want to take the salad trimmings that have already been dressed, okay? No oils or things like that. So it's just all those bits, if you've had salad or you have leftover without the salad dressing on it, can go in your compost, right? Shredded paper is something you can go in there. Gosh, how much junk mail do we still get, right? So the idea that you can be shredding that, not necessarily recycling it and putting it into your pile. Leaves, green leaves, brown leaves, they can all go in, right? Grass clippings, yes, they can go in. However, grass clippings are a great source of nitrogen and they are a great fertilizer for your lawn. So if you have a mulching blade on your mower, keep your grass clippings on your lawn, okay? That's going to help with the fertilization process and keeping your lawn healthy through the season. That being said, we all go on vacation, the grass gets a little too long. You might have to pick up stuff at some point, or you just don't want that much sitting on your yard. You can certainly throw them in the compost bin. And it's a great inoculant. We were talking about it earlier, has a high nitrogen level and it kickstarts your compost if your compost is a little slow in what it's doing. Chipped tree, see, I never get this right. Chipped shrub and tree trimmings, say that 5 times fast, is also a part that you can put in there, okay? Livestock manures is something you can add as well. Again, a high nitrogen component there. So it's a great inoculant to start your pile. One caution here is know your source, okay? The idea, especially if you're going more of an organic route, you wanna make sure that, okay, if you're picking up horse manure, cow manure, are they on antibiotics? Have they eaten anything recently? Where are they feeding from? What's their food source? So understanding that and then knowing what you're putting in is, that's so you're much more educated on what you're doing. Go ahead. Materials to avoid. And this is something too that I know sometimes there's some confusion because there are services in Monroe County that will collect a lot more of your food waste. They're taking it to a biodigester and using a high heat component. So you can put things like dairy and meat and all those in a backyard scenario. You do not want to do that, okay? But there are services that will do that if that's something you want to take on, more of the burden of what you're producing. So diseased plant materials, yes. I would avoid putting them in. My mantra is you don't want it in your garden or your yard, don't put it in your compost, okay? The idea that those still would be things that you would bag up and put in the landfill, okay? Because you don't want to spread diseases if we can. So that's something, even some of those invasive weeds like garlic mustard and things like that, bag it and put it. You don't want to try to put that in your bin. Pet droppings, also don't avoid putting those in. The pathogens and bacteria in your pet waste will not be killed in a hot composting scenario in your backyard. It needs to be, again, much higher temperature in order to kill those. So that's something that you would avoid putting it in. I have to say also avoid human waste. Sometimes they do talk about urine being used, but again, not something you really want to mess with in a backyard scenario. So just stay away from that. Meat, fat, grease, oils, and bones. Okay, those are the things that when they start to rot, they smell. And that's what attracts some of those critters that you don't really want, and to help you aerating the pile, right? So again, you want to avoid putting those in. Dairy products, same thing. The idea when it starts to go, it has a foul odor that some animals love. And that's, of course, one thing we don't want to have in our backyard, okay? Weeds, there are two schools of thought on this. Again, if you don't want it in your garden, don't put it in your compost. But sometimes that's all we got, right? On all of our green material, we've got a lot of weeds. So understanding that if you're cold composting, and I'm going to talk about the hot and cold in a minute, the idea is that if you're just letting it sit and not touching it, those weed seeds are never going to die, okay? So if once you do have the compost available at the bottom of the pile, you put that out, you're just spreading them everywhere. So the idea is that if you want to put weeds in, take the seeds off, take the seed heads off, right? And still dispose of them. So the same thing, like, if you are one that's going to pull up dandelions and things like that, if it's already starting to go to seed, obviously, if you can capture them, put them in a bag and get rid of it. So go ahead. Some additions to the pile that people don't think about are coffee grounds, tea bags. So coffee is a great source, again, of nitrogen. So, and this is something that, if you are coffee drinkers, great. There are also national chains that have free programs that you can pick up grounds for free, that they'd rather not put them in the trash. So go to your local coffee shop and ask, hey, can I have your grounds? Again, understanding that you want to avoid some of the flavored stuff and things, or things that way, but still, it is a great way and a source to get them if you're not a coffee drinker yourself. Eggshells is the one component of the animal waste that you can put in. Again, it's a it has a nitrogen content, and it also is forms as a grit. And basically, worms need grit to process things, right? This eggshells turn into the bran muffin for worms, essentially. Okay, another food analogy. How many are counting so far? But yeah, so they need that. So often, what I do is if I crack an egg, I will give it a quick rinse, crush it in my hand, throw it into my kitchen little collector that I take out daily to my compost bin, right? And I just crush it, throw it in, and then off it goes to the pile. Dryer lint is something you can put in, okay? Most of your materials now are all organically based, right? Even our polyesters come from a polycarbon that, guess what, came from the ground, right? So the idea that you can put your dryer lint in, and it's amazing how much, when you're cleaning out that dryer filter, how quickly you can accumulate that to put in. Pet and or human hair. Yes, we can't put their waste in, but if you're brushing them, whatever, you can put that in as well. Shredded paper, again, back to that. Newspaper, mail, cardboard. Oh my gosh, how many people have 10,000 Amazon boxes, right? If you run anything to recycle, you can actually shred that up and put that in as well. Understanding too that a lot of the papers, some of the questions that come in, most of your inks now are soy-based, so there's not an issue there as far as toxins in the inks. So what you want to avoid is your glossies, like no glossy magazines, shiny material, because there's still a chemical component in that is not going to do well in your decomposition process. So but take care of all that other those envelopes and all those things, minus the plastic window, and basically it's about changing our habits, right? Understanding before you put it in the trash, can I put it in the compost? Can I actually compost this? So now we're going to talk about the inexact science. So I'll get back to this side. There's two processes, okay? Cold composting takes more calendar time. This is what's happening out in nature, okay? It's just taking its time. Sometimes it can take, 6 months or, a few seasons. Larger materials like trees and stuff, obviously going to take a long time to decompose, right? Hot composting is a faster way to do it, but it requires a little more of your time and attention. And again, if we're impatient, we only have 2 seasons to really use this, in our yard. We want it to happen faster. It can, what's nice about it too, is that with your cold composting, you're going to put a lot in, and then maybe at the end, you go to the bottom of the pile and you can harvest stuff out because there's still stuff on top that hasn't decomposed. Hot composting, you're aerating, you're turning the pile, and you're actually going to get more volume, more bang for your buck if you keep that attention. Okay. So what's nice about cold composting is it's pretty easy, right? You add materials to the bin or the pile, you wait, and then you harvest, and it just happens, right? But as I said, it takes some time for this to happen. The advantages: easy and carefree, low maintenance, and it does adapt to your space. So, if you've got a small yard, you can have a small pile, based on your collection. If you have a larger yard, obviously you can have, you can put it in the back 40, right? And have a larger pile or a few piles, right? Go ahead. Disadvantages is, as I mentioned, the time. It's not going to get hot enough, as we mentioned earlier, to kill any weeds, seeds, or pathogens. So that's one thing, if you're concerned that, you had a wonderful person that offered to come and help you weed one day and then put everything in, and you're like, oh gosh, I'm going to have dill everywhere, or not dill, but dandelions everywhere next year. That's one thing that you're like, oh, I wish I was doing hot composting. And again, it doesn't decompose uniformly. Go ahead. So hot composting can be as ready and as fast as several weeks. Here, my average here is about 6 to 8 weeks during spring and summer. So it's actually pretty good. When I lived in Texas, and we had a larger bin system at the gardens where I was volunteering, we were spot on at 8 weeks, if not a little earlier, but we had a lot more volume. Okay, it does require turning the pile, aerating. And it can be as easy as just digging and burying your kitchen waste on a daily basis on a different part of your pile. But then at times, depending on how much you have, you're going to have to do some flipping. And I do have some tools. We'll talk about that to make it easier. It does require a proper ratio of ingredients. Okay, and we'll talk about that. And it can reach up to 160, if not more degrees. I'm going to pass this around. This is a handy little Christmas gift that I got one year. I get this best Christmas presents. It's a compost thermometer, and it's going to show where you can stick this into your pile, and it's going to tell you what temperature, what is actually happening in your pile. For instance, today, we woke up and it was in the 40s. I put this in my pile and it was at 85, which means that, yeah, I'm not quite hot, but I'm warming up, and it's active. It means things are happening in the pile. So don't poke anyone's eye out, but check it out. You can also use a meat thermometer if you want to do that. Just tie a rope. I highly recommend, so you don't lose it in the pile and then need it when you're cooking the turkey. And then again, if you're getting the pile up to within that 120 to 160 degree range, it's going to kill those weed seeds in there. So that's a good thing, right? You want to get the weed seeds out of there so that you're not going to spread those weeds in your next spread. So this is what's necessary, and some people get a little, I don't like bugs, but these are the stars in your compost pile. Okay, these are what's making it hot. These microorganisms, bugs, insects, all of them are making it hot. And I like to compare this to a good wedding. All right, if you have open bar, don't necessarily have an open bar. But if you have good food and a good DJ and good music and people are on the dance floor, what happens? The room heats up, right? This is the same thing for your compost pile, okay? You need to have the right ratio of ingredients and the right diet for them, and then they're going to heat the pile up. And it's amazing how quickly they will decompose the material, okay? They'll process the material. Go ahead. So the proper ratio, and this is where it gets a little scientific, but don't let your head explode on this, okay? Carbon and nitrogen ratio. We all, as organic organisms, have a carbon to nitrogen ratio, okay? And the proper ratio you need, or the proper diet you need for your decomposers, is a 30-to-1 ratio. Basically, that's 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen, or an easier way to remember it is carbon is your browns, okay? Any part of a tree. twigs, leaves, brown leaves, bark, sawdust, clippings, and understanding shredded paper, all of that is part of your browns, okay? The green is your nitrogen, that's your kitchen waste. Your green cross clippings, your green, what you've just cut from your garden, okay? So anything that's still somewhat living has a higher nitrogen content. The microorganisms need the carbon, just like us, it's like carbs. They need the carbon for energy, and then they need the nitrogen for protein. Okay, so obviously if you get the right amount of carbon and nitrogen in there, that's gonna make them more active and feed them as well. Go ahead. So as I mentioned, everything has a carbon to nitrogen ratio, and understanding that some things have a higher ratio, so they're gonna take, the higher the carbon and nitrogen, the longer it's gonna take to decompose. Okay, so like we all know, sawdust, you think, wow, it's in little bits and pieces, it should disappear quick. For some reason, has a very high carbon to nitrogen ratio, so it's going to take a lot longer to decompose. Doesn't mean you can't put it in your pile, but understanding that you're going to need a lot more nitrogen to bring that ratio up to 30 to 1, right? The most common when you think about it are like leaves from oaks, okay, so 40 to 80 ratio, and then you're adding your vegetable waste, which is a 12 to 1 or 21. You're gonna kind of get a feel that, okay, obviously I need more browns than I do greens. And that's, you know, you don't have to wig out with the math, okay? Because the basic rule of thumb is you need about 3 times as much brown as you do green in your pile, okay? And that's just, like I said, it's inexact, kind of a rough number, but because people just start to think, oh my gosh, I got to figure this out. Just understanding that you're going to have a lot more layers of brown with your greens, okay? And I joke that, again, another food analogy, it's like grandma's lasagna. She makes it, it's wonderful every time. She may not put the same ingredients every time, but it always tastes good, right? So, but it's understanding that you're going to need that right volume or right component of your browns and greens. Go ahead. So in order to achieve that in an easy, manageable way, you need to have a certain volume. And the volume is this 3 by 3 by 3 foot, no smaller, okay, in a bin scenario. But understanding that you want that 27 cubic feet volume to help you achieve that 30 to 1. You certainly don't want to make it too big, because if you're turning this pile, I mean, anything this tall and trying to turn it, forget it, right? So you want to make it manageable. And we're going to talk about size of bins in a minute. You want to make it, put it in a place that's easy, right? Like something that it's like, okay, I don't mind going out and dumping this, my kitchen waste, or, you know, your kids, like, you know, it's not something that they have to stomp out, you know, a half mile to the back of the yard to do it. Understanding that it needs to be close and easy for you to do, because if you're doing it right, it will never smell, which is often a myth. People are like, oh, you're composting, yep, it's gonna smell, should never smell, okay? If we don't tend to have this issue here in Rochester, but we did when I first moved back in the summer of 2020. We had a very hot, dry summer, and I did need to add water to my pile, right? Because again, these microorganisms, they need air and water like we do, okay? So it's the idea that you're gonna need to have that there. And understanding too, where you put your pile, because of that air component, don't put it flush up against a wall, you know, have air accessible on all 4 sides, okay? And this is often something we talk about with tumblers, that sometimes they may not let enough air in, okay? And we'll talk about that in a minute. Go ahead. So simple mesh enclosure is your easiest. I mean, you can spend a lot of money on these things, or you can spend very simple. I have my nice little model here, which is chicken wire. And if you want stakes, fine. You don't have to even have the stakes. Usually this stuff is pretty self-supportive. Again, you want to try to get that 27 cubic foot ratio type of thing going. So at least probably a 4.5 foot diameter, okay, just to help you with that. And the idea that you can choose different mediums, understanding that you don't want it too small too, again, because if you're going to aerate your pile, in order to turn in there, you don't want your pitchfork getting caught in all of this, right? So give yourself space, okay? They have things called shepherd's bins, which is a great component too, which is nice because you can create your bin in a part of the yard, do the composting process for 6 months to a year. And then when it's ready to harvest, and you don't even have to lift it out, you just pick up the bin and you move it to another part of a yard. This is great if you're trying to amend garden beds or create a garden bed. Do this in one corner where you want your bed to be, lift it, and then move the bin somewhere else the next year, for your next shepherd's bins. So they, move around like shepherds, right? Yeah, so that's but certainly you can do it, with this even as well. It doesn't have to be specific to, you don't have to order anything specific. Go ahead. Then we can get pretty fancy, right? So we've got like a 3-bin system, which originally when this system was devised, it's talking about, you put your contents in and then you move that work, right? So the idea is what we do and what I did when we built this system here, we thought we were going to have chickens, so we had an extra bin. It turned actually out to work out really well with 4. And again, this was a demonstration garden that had 27 demonstration gardens, so a lot of garden waste. So, but we would work it that, we'd add ingredients in, we would process them by chopping up the ingredients as much as we could. And usually by the time we were moving to the 3rd bin, we were harvesting from the 1st. Okay, so then you didn't have to do all the moving, right? Because that can be arduous, right? So, and you can use any materials, wood, cinder blocks, the wire, the landscape fabric, any of those you can use. This was my bin in Houston. It's also my bin here. My husband and I have a kind of a standing joke that we've moved 11 times. For him, it's not home until he has a grill, because he can't move grills, and at least transatlantic, statewide, whatever. And it's not home for me until I have my compost bin. So he knows pretty well that once the boxes are pretty much unpacked, he's building me a bin. And what I have is something that I'm keeping that volume, that 3x3, but this is actually a 4x4x2. And what I like about this is that because, and we were talking about earlier, I got these sore shoulders and things like that, that at a 2-foot level, I can stick my pitchfork in and rest it on this 2x4, and I get the leverage I need to make aerating really easy. I'm not lifting it all just by my brute power. So, and it's nice too. I do use pressure treated for the 4x4s just because you don't want it to rot. And again, they've gotten a lot better now with your pressure treated, as far as mounts and things. It's not going to leach. It's going to affect anything in your immediate neighborhood. But then I do use cedar, and I use the cedar trellis because the neighbors say, "Why, that looks lovely. What is that?" And I said, "It's a compost bin. Would you like to add to it?" And then my neighbor right now she's adding every day, and I'll promise her a bucket or 2 if she doesn't make me angry. No, she's great. So, but I forget I'm being recorded here. I got to watch what I say. No, but it is great. It's a good. It's nice to look at, and it does encourage people to discussion like, "Oh, what are you doing? And can I help?" So, and again, that's another shepherd's bin there on the side. So those are your samples. You can have the multi-bin system. The one thing that we have to understand is some people put the lids on them. Again, you need water. And this is something like if you do want to keep critters out, and I understand sometimes if you've got some larger ones, you can do this, but it has to be a permeous or permeable surface so that water can get in. Okay, if you constantly cover, it's not going to get the water it needs to keep those critters happy. It also needs air, so you want to make sure you have airflow on the bottom. Okay, but there's other ways to do it by just lifting. So tumblers, again, you can spend a lot of money on these things that are little, and we joked that sometimes you often need 2. It's like, and probably see, you're the generation, you might get this joke. Used to be when you owned a Jaguar, you needed 2 because one was always in the shop, right? It's kind of the same idea with tumblers, is that if you're actively composting and adding every day, at some point it's going to fill up, right? So it's understanding that you might need 2, or understanding how much waste you create before you invest. Because then you might understand that, oh, maybe just a bin outside is a better situation. Or if you're in an apartment setting or a condo setting or something where you need to keep it contained and you don't have as much yard waste and things like that, then tumblers are obvious, can be a good option for you. Okay, I do know that especially when I'm living in Texas, I had a friend that had one of these tumblers, and she said basically by the time she harvested compost, because, and we had extreme temperatures there, right? But that the hardware and everything, like she could no longer turn it because the handle had fallen off, things like that, because it just took so much longer because she didn't have the right ratios. So that's another thing to caution with here. Understanding that you're not just, if you can't just put kitchen waste in, you need to have those brown ingredients. You need to have leaves. You need to have shredded paper. Things like that need to go in. Oftentimes what happens in tumblers is people put all their food waste in and nothing else. And then guess what? That's when it's going to smell. Okay. It's become anaerobic. There's nothing in there dry to keep the critters happy. And actually they're going to leave. Okay. Because they don't want super wet conditions. They really don't like super dry conditions either. They need that balance. So sometimes that tends to be what happens. You know, I get complaints. It's like, oh, I put everything in the tumbler and then it just smells. And it's like, because you've just got rotting food there. You don't have any browns in there. And the thing is that it's fixable. If you do have that anaerobic scenario, get some brown leaves, get some shredded paper when you don't have leaves available, things like that, and add that in. And it's amazing how quickly that'll turn it around. Okay. So go ahead. Again, you can spend a lot of money, or you can go on the internet and find all sorts of different plans on how to make your own. Again, one of the other concerns with this is the understanding that you need to put holes in there for air. But of course, when you put holes in and you're turning it, what happens? Stuff falls out. Right. So that's why I tend to recommend more a bin system than I do this. Just because it's easier to solve some of the problems that people have with it. Again, though, if you do choose to do it, and this is like on rollers, understanding that if you're going to use a barrel or something that needs to be food grade, again, you don't want anything that's come from a chemical factory, that make sure you're conscious of that if you want that organic component to your compost. Go ahead. So let's build a pile. Okay, this is the exciting part, right? Again, you're going to work with your browns and your green levels. And then the idea is that you can take all sorts of browns. Okay. So what I start with a pile, even though this is enclosed at the bottom with the wood, I start with a 3 to 4 inch layer of sticks. Okay. Broken up, break up those sticks, put them in, because that's going to allow airflow down at the bottom. Okay. And then you're just going to build layers. And it's the idea, if you can do this, start a pile, and then you're going to just add layers and layers and layers. And at some point, those layers are going to, when you aerate, obviously, are going to move around. But if you can start a pile like this, it's amazing how quickly you can get a hot pile. When I built it, this little pile, when I went back 4 or 5 days later, was 140 degrees. Okay, so it had all the right ingredients. The critters were happy. And then we just kept adding to it and moving things around, and they were happy with that. So with the sticks, then we get your brown leaves, okay, or that brown waste in there. Again, 4 to 5 inches, whatever works. And then add, in this case, these are coffee grounds. Okay, that's your nitrogen. That's your kitchen waste. Put that in. You see, obviously, not as much of that as you have the other. I did add livestock manure in here, and this was just a bag of composted manure, okay? Back to knowing your source. That is a heavily regulated industry, so you know that what you're getting is okay. You can put that in, right? And this is what jump starts the pile. I mean, they love their manures, okay, those critters, okay? Then this is actually garden waste. It already looks brown, but it's only 2 days old. That was sitting in the heat in Houston, but it's already decomposing, right? It's already rotting in the bin that I had, and I added it to the pile. And then another component you can add is actually soil, okay? All of those container plants at the end of the summer, take them and just dump the whole thing into your compost, right? And you'll see probably when you saw the compost that went around, there were little bits of vermiculite in there because they had added soil from potted plants into that. So that's not going to go away. It's really not going to hurt when you're putting it back into the garden scenario. And then as a top layer, I used pine needles. Pine needles, they're really acidic, yes, but you're not going to have that much that it's going to throw there's no way in a backyard scenario you're going to throw off the acid pH in the pH level in your, it's going to bring things neutralized because it's going to decompose, but understanding that they take longer to decompose, okay? They're like your sawdust. It's going to take longer to decompose, but it's not a bad thing in the middle of the pile because then it does act like your stick layer at the bottom, because it allows for airflow. Okay, it allows for things to crawl through, water to get through. So understanding that you can have that component is also good. Obviously, don't do all pine needles, but the understanding that, you know, that's a good thing to have in your layers. Go ahead. So particle size. Size does make a difference in this, and it's obvious, right? When you're throwing in, you don't want to throw large sticks and things into your pile, because, well, first of all, you're going to fight when you're trying to turn it with your pitchfork or whatever, that you're going to get sticks caught in it. So the smaller you can break those sticks, the better. Usually, as a rule of thumb, I say no, you know, diameter-wise, twig-wise, like, you know, pencil or even small finger, but of course everyone's finger sizes, small fingers are different, so stick to the pencil, but understanding if it is thicker, then just make it a smaller piece, right? And this is where loppers or your pruners can help you process and put it in. Certainly if you have a chipper or shredder, that would help, obviously, but not everyone has that available. So yes, the smaller the particles, they do decompose faster. Using a lawnmower to shred those leaves before you go in helps, okay? Especially if you have like the waxy leaves, like the magnolia leaves, things like that in there, give them a run over with the lawnmower. If you have a bag when you're not mulching your grass clippings, then just dump them in chopped, and that'll help. Or just run over them. One friend that would run over in the driveway and then scoop them up and put them in. But so that's a good way to help with size. Certainly kitchen waste, you can use a blender, but boy, that kitchen waste disappears pretty quickly. So I wouldn't, if you want to make this easy, right? You don't want to make it more time consuming, but certainly you can do that if you so choose. Chipper I already talked about, and the pruner. Go ahead. So back to all life needs air and water. Okay, so just because you put the browns and greens in there, understanding that they do need the oxygen to breathe, that increases their aerobic activity in the pile. And then the moisture also adds to the bacterial and bacterial and fungal growth, okay? And we already see that happening, right? With, you know, in fact, I just took a rotten lime, got stuck way back in the drawer in the fridge. And like, okay, it's already decomposing, throw it in. That's fine to put in, right? Those are those bacteria and fungi that you need. Obviously, if we get a lot of rain, too much rain, what's going to happen? The pile gets wet, really heavy. Everything squishes down, and those microorganisms are like, I'm out of here. I can't breathe, right? So they go back down into the ground or escape. So the idea that that's when you need to turn the pile, because if it does get too wet, and that's one thing too, I forgot to mention, when you're locating your bin or pile, don't put it in the lowest, wettest part of your yard, because then it might turn into a, you know, chronic problem of being anaerobic all the time. Okay, if you got a wet area, that is not the place to put your compost bin, okay, for that reason. On the same side, flip side of it, you know, we have a lot of dry weather, and sometimes it can dry out. Like even right now, even though we had rain on Sunday, I feel like my pile is still a little dry. I'm going to add some water. So this is where the inexact science comes in. You're going to start to know your pile if you're going out and checking it. You don't have to do it every day, but you know, the idea that, you know, once or twice a week, you're looking and seeing if there's no activity. If your pile is hot, then you know things are happening, like in that high temperature range, you know that they're happy, leave it be. Don't bust up the party. Don't be the cops. Don't do that. Just let them have their fun. But then you might find that the pile is going to cool off, and you can still see a lot of things that you recognize, right? You know, there's still food bits in there. Think, okay, it's obviously a little off balance. What does it need? Does it need some water, or does it just need to be turned? Usually, as I say, avoiding like when you're worried about putting the food waste in and with your critters, if you have, because you have so much brown waste, burying your your kitchen waste in the middle, like, so if you dig and put your kitchen waste in and then cover it, that usually deters them from coming and bothering the pile. Okay, so and it's aerating it. Look at that. You turn the pile in just that little area. So that's good. Go ahead. So yeah, we talk about turning. I didn't bring a pitchfork because we all know what a pitchfork is, but it is your right hand tool, right? The higher the pile gets. This was another great Christmas present I got from my father-in-law. Of course, he borrows it more often than I'd like to say, but he's 83 and he needs help turning the pile, right? So it's a great mechanism where you stick it into the pile. You don't have to be physically lifting. These hinges, this opens up, and then you just turn and pull, and it automatically creates air spaces. So that helps. You're not physically turning it over, but you're adding the air that it needs when it's pretty compressed. Go ahead. So, and then when's it ready? Well, obviously it's when it smells earthy. It no longer heats up and you can identify. Now, if you just have one bin like I do, I'm putting stuff in all the time, right? So, but it is getting ready to harvest. Like I have a lot of volume right now. There's stuff on the top and I am trying to incorporate it, but I want to harvest this compost for my perennials and my annuals that I'm going to be putting in, right? So this is where a sifter works well. And this is where, again, you're just taking some landscape fabric. I would suggest no less than 1/2 inch. You don't want to make it too small because you want the good stuff to get through, but then it keeps the other stuff that hasn't decomposed in, and then you just throw that back in the pile to keep doing what it's doing, okay? One thing I would recommend is know what you're sifting into so you can custom make it so it sits like this sits on a wagon that I have, or if you have a wheelbarrow, there are ways where you can actually do this. What we have at CCE office where it's a little larger than this and it's on legs and wheels, and you can put the wheelbarrow right underneath it, throw the stuff on top, shake it a few times, and then take the wheelbarrow and off you go. So depending on how much you're creating, there's different ways to do it. But this is a great way if you only have 1 or 2 piles or bins that you can sift and get what you need when you want it. Okay, next slide. And there it is. And occasionally you're going to have a volunteer, but you don't mind weeding dill or tomato volunteers, right? So, but that's what you want. You want that nice gardener's gold is what we call. So there is a situation now, and I've had this slide in forever, but never really saw the use for it. Asian jumping worms. Ugh, hopefully nobody has them. It's becoming a problem. They are present in Monroe County. If you feel, and you're going to recognize these worms because when you do see them and touch them, they do flail. They're the cowl around the body is a lot whiter, so you might recognize it that way. But these guys are evil. They're processors, decomposers, but they take every nutrient out of the soil instead of creating the nutrients we need. So if you find that you've got them in your compost, you're going to need to sterilize that compost before you put it out because the larva won't die probably, and even at that 160. I mean, you have to keep that for at least 2 weeks, and unless you're on top of it, that's going to be difficult to do. So you can, that old turkey roaster pan, we only use it at Thanksgiving, right? So bake it, put at a 200 degree oven for 30 minutes, and that's going to kill those pathogens or the larva that's in there. Okay, obviously this is pretty arduous, and again, it's like if you've got this issue, I am still researching because this is all new on how to do it at a larger level outside, whether you're using plastics and stuff to help. But the problem is like if you get too hot for too long, you're going to kill a lot of the good stuff that's still in their compost, right? So it's trying to find that balance of curing it so you don't do that. Go ahead. So where to use it? I composted for years and didn't realize, oh, I can actually use this. I was just doing it to get the leaves out of my yard and all that. It's like, wow, I can actually put this. Now I never understood, or it didn't dawn on me till later. That's like, wow, that's why the trees are always so much taller around my compost bin, right? They're taking advantage of all the compost that was going in. So yeah, adding it to your soil amendment, you loosen up those clay soils or improve the water retention in your sandy soils. Include that in. There are schools of thought now, like when you're putting new plants or trees in, that you maybe shouldn't be putting compost in the bit or in the hole itself because the roots might get too happy right where it's at if the soil is not really great outside of it. So that's where they tend to get root bound. So I suggest you can put a little bit in, but certainly put compost around the top. Okay, and let those microorganisms work their way up to feed off what's still there in that compost. CountryMax, you definitely can add it into your container plants. It's going to include or increase the soil or the water retention. So if you don't have to water those planters every day, what a great thing. Usually you talk about a 2 2/3 potting potting mix to 1/3 of your compost and stir it in to your pots. Okay, and that's going to help. Raised beds, still same thing. And the nice idea with raised beds is once you've put that into the raised beds or that similar formula, adding it continuously through the season is great because it is, you'll notice as your soil gets more and more compact as you water and whatnot. So that's giving it a fresh boost of food and soil for your plants throughout the season. So as you harvest the compost, you can certainly keep continuing to add it. You can, as I mentioned, use it as a mulch, putting it around the plants. Just like mulch though, don't put it right up against the stems because if it is, it shouldn't still be hot. I mean, you should have it down to that cooler level, but any mulch or anything that you put right against the stem, that starts to eat away at the stem or the bark of your tree, right? So you want to give it air and space because that's decomposing still. Okay, so that steals nitrogen away from the plant itself and might stress the plant out. So keep it around close, but not too close. Lawn top dressing, certainly, wow, if we could have the piece of equipment, I would so love it right now that I could just put a 1/4 inch of compost all over my entire yard. Wouldn't that be awesome? I haven't seen it yet unless you're gonna get a big piece of farm equipment. But it is great when you have trouble spots in your yard, right? Take your compost, scatter it a 1/4 inch level, and that's gonna be that little vitamin booster, mineral booster that it needs to help fight off whatever is stressing it out and bring that back into balance, that soil back into balance. Compost tea is also something you can make. Again, understanding that when you're brewing this, and there are lots of recipes online, I do have a link at the end of that will show you links on how to do all this. But understanding that what you're making is a very concentrated liquid fertilizer. So use it sparingly, okay? Understand that it's very strong when you use it. So again, don't let it hit the leaves of the plant and keep it in a circular area around the plant, but not directly around the stem or in the roots because you don't want it to burn the plants. Go ahead. And then there's vermicomposting. So this is just quick. Again, if you don't have the space and if you're in an apartment, worms are for you. Or if you don't want to go out in the winter to your pile, worms are another great option. They're great pets. They don't make any noise. They don't need to be watched when you go on vacation because you can just leave the food in there and a week later they're still there. Go ahead and next slide. So, and you can make it as simple as a bin. Again, they need air. So you're going to take a recycled plastic bin, cut a window in it, put some screening on it so they have to breathe. Take your newspaper, shred it up, and wet it down, and that's your bedding. And then you order the red wiggler worms. These are very fast composters. You're not getting them out of your yard. These are what you want. They can eat up to their weight in food waste a day. Okay, so if you order a 1/2 pound of worms, they could eat a 1/2 pound of your trimmings or your kitchen waste. So understanding how much you create and take a couple of weeks to see how much you actually produce as your kitchen waste will help you know how much to order. Because you always want to exercise on the lowest side, because guess what? They reproduce. And then you can share worms with other people, right? So, but the idea is, so if you get like a 1/2 pound of worms, you can order them online. They come and they just need to be in a cool, dark place. So they can be in a closet. They can be in a garage in the summer, as long, again, making sure they don't get too hot. In the basement, they're easy. The woman actually in this book talks about how she has a coffee table where they're in. Okay, so she's pretty enthusiastic, but you don't have to go to that extreme. But go ahead, next slide. So you're putting them in. The worms are underneath. You take your food waste and lift a little bit of the bedding, put the food waste in. They are a little more finicky as to what they'll eat. They don't want citrus. And there's certain things that and again, stay away from the oils and things like that, but they can eat most of your kitchen waste. Okay, so it's a great idea. Like, again, if you don't want to go out into the sub-zero temps to go to your pile, this is also an option. And then they create this lovely, if we call compost Gardener's Gold, this is Gardener's Platinum. It is so nutrient rich. The worm castings are so nutrient rich that I have friends that vermicompost, and this only goes on their special plants. Like, oh, that's, this goes on my special tropical plant, or things like that. So it's really, really nutritious and great for house plants. Again, if you're in an apartment setting, it's great because then you have it all right contained in your house. Go ahead. And all it involves, it's maybe 4 months. You're doing this. You don't have to do it every 2 weeks. You're not doing it every week. You separate the worms from the castings, and then you start over. And you can see, like I say, usually you get a few more than when you started. They don't crawl out. Again, if this gets too wet, they may try to crawl up the sides. But it's, again, an understanding, I got to get some dry in there. I got to put some more newspaper or something in there to balance it out. But certainly it's a great way to compost without all the space and the heavy lifting. Compost tea, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of ways you can do it. You can have aquarium filters and do all sorts of fun things for brewing, or you can just stick some in a sock and let it steep for 24 hours or 36 hours. They're all different options, but understanding, again, what you're creating can be quite strong. So just be careful on how you use it. All right, we talked about all that. This is where you need, or this is my Bible. The CCE, and even if you just remember the Monroe CCE Cornell part of it under horticulture, we have a great compost resource page. It has probably 40 links just on that page alone on how to build your bins, troubleshooting, the compost tea, any of it, okay? And there's videos, there's all sorts of things. Also, we have our helpline you can call, and certainly email if you have questions too. But this is a great resource for you if you're not, if you have troubleshooting. And I think we talked about most of these. So we'll flip to the next. That's it. If anyone wants to fill out online, I forgot to bring paper, sorry, because I could have composted it after them, but this is a survey just as far as how I did tonight. So feel free on Zoom if you want to do that. But now I will answer questions. You can flip on the lights and how'd I do? What time is it? Okay, good. So yeah, so that was a lot of information. I know usually, people are like, I see the aha moment sometimes, and then other people are like, huh? So have at me. What questions do you have? Yep. So you'll recognize it when it's pretty much all castings, because they'll even process the paper too, right? That's going to go away. You're going to have to put some rubber gloves on and sort them through. Understanding you might miss a few one way or the other, but yeah, that's that you're just going to have to hand sort it out. And I had a friend, like, she puts a piece of plastic out, she dumps it out, and she just sorts through. It's a great activity to do with kids. They love the worms as long as they don't squish too much, right? So, but yeah, that's how you would do that. Anything else? Great question. I didn't talk about that. Hot composting has nothing to do with the sun or the ambient temperature. It's about that activity in the pile. So you can have your pile in the shade. Yeah, you don't have to worry about that. One thing I will caution is that, in fact, I just had a master gardener send me an email over the weekend. He's like, I've had this bin here for 20 years, and now I've got roots. Like, what's going on? And his neighbor's silver maple that's 50 feet away has found it, right? So you are going to maybe have an issue in shade with roots. Mine is near Norway maple, and after 3 years, I'm having the issue. I said to him, I'm surprised you're not having this. You didn't have this problem sooner. Which sometimes is a good proponent for being able to move that bin around, okay? But yeah, certainly you can have it in the shade or the sun. That temperature makes the activity is not coming from that sun or shade factor. Now, that being said, obviously winter is going to have an effect on your pile, okay? Because they are going to get cold in that pile, right? Unless you can keep the pile, and I do have friends that do this. They surround it with bales of straw. They do put a tarp on, but they allow snow in at some points, but they try to keep that ambient temperature or their thing warmer. The wind will dry out a pile like that. And gosh, haven't we had a lot of wind, right? So the idea that protecting that pile a little bit in the winter might increase you still have some activity. But really, when you think about it, are you doing any gardening in February? So here, not so much an issue, right? It is amazing. You know, I add to my pile 365 days. Obviously, sometimes it's not as active, but boy, in the last 3 weeks, it's kicking, right? You know, everyone's happy now. I know it's so because the ambient temperature is helpful in that the critters are coming up out of the ground. I mean, that's just by nature. So if you want to keep them up in there, you've got to create a little more of that happy wedding, you know, reception type scenario. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't make a difference if it's in sun or shade. The water is an issue. That's the only issue. Yep.
I heard the onion scraps and citrus.
That's for your vermicomposting. Okay. That's where the worms, the red wigglers and stuff aren't that, they don't like it. I have not had an issue. I have not had a worm come up to me and say, hey, I don't want that onion in this pile. No, I mean, again, you have to put a lot in for that to affect, and they're going to just go to a different part of the pile. Wow. See, I'd have to do a little research on that. So, yeah, I don't usually. So it helps with the nitrogen, right? Yeah. I mean, again, when you're putting things into the compost bin and you're harvesting, you're at the point where, as I say, you should have that pH level should be in that 5 to 7 range. Now, obviously, certain plants like more acid or more alkaline. So then you're going to maybe add a different component to that. Like, for instance, my hydrangeas. I take those coffee grounds and I just put them around the hydrangea plants because they want the acid. They want that high acid. So there are ways to amend the soil different, but when you're talking about compost, when you're harvesting it is within that 5 to 7 pH range. So it really shouldn't affect it. And large schemes like this, that's the same thing, like with the pine needles and things like that. I mean, you'd have to have a lot for that to really affect your pH level, you know, more base or acidic. So. Well, so like I say, during this time of year, like I'm trying to go out there, you know, maybe once a week. Again, measuring the heat in the pile, and you don't have to have the fancy thermometer, which where is that? I don't know people walking off of my thermometer. Let me take this over here. You can tell just by you know, touch, right? I mean, certainly you don't want to be sticking your hand in if the pile's steaming. I mean, I've been to windrow composting where you couldn't stick your hand in the pile because it would burn your hand, right? But you can certainly tell if it's hot. Oh, and I just completely lost my train of thought. What was your question? Yeah, so I mean, so if it's warm, leave it be. But then if you think it's cold, or, you know, nothing's really happening, then certainly turning it more and kind of getting everything where it needs to be is helpful. Well, again, it depends. You got to look at your pile. Like I said, if you have a lot of kitchen waste and no brown and nothing's happening, then it's probably going to become more anaerobic and wet. Then yes, you definitely need to add brown. It might be a case if the pile is just dry. If there's not a lot of activity going, add a bucket of water or take the hose and just spray it, get it down into the layers. Certainly different times of year, boy, during the year, like fall, if you can add pumpkins, that's a wet, and even watermelon rinds and all that, they're wet components, that is helpful in a dry pile. But burying it, like I say, if you're going in and, you know, worried about squirrel or raccoon or, you know, whatever, possum, I mean, I consider them aerators for me. It's like, gosh, if you can dig the pile and I don't have to today, that's fine, right? And I'll share whatever's there. But if you bury it so that kind of discourages them, that's a good way to aerate your pile. But just like I put mine, I mean, again, I've got a 4-foot. I try to put my kitchen waste in a different part of the pile every day. The most difficult part now is me remembering where I put it yesterday. So, and you'll find out pretty quickly. You dig and it's like, oh yeah, it's there. So that's the case usually where, you know, your meats and yeah, the sugars I would stay away from. Again, that's where taking it to a service. Sorry, if the pasta doesn't have sauce and stuff on it and the oils, then, you know, if it's just, I don't know who eats just plain pasta, right? But You know, maybe the one, you know, the little kid that's, but you want to avoid any of the oils and the things that are going to cause that thing to smell, because then that's when you get that stinky scenario on your tract. So, but to be fair on that, I could say there are services that you can do that. The city of Rochester has a pilot program right now that they're collecting everything, right? But then they are taking it to a biodigester, so that applies very high heat and kills all those things. And it's in a contained scenario or setting. So, but in the backyard scenario, I wouldn't recommend it. No, I haven't seen it happen. Again, you got, well, yeah, you have to have a lot of, I mean, again, it's not a methane thing there. It's just the activity, the microbial activity that's going on. I mean, it can steam. And again, if it's steaming, then again, you want to avoid, like you do with mulch, you want to make sure that gets some air and cools off before you put around your plants. But yeah, I've never seen one catch on fire. Never say never. Anyone else? Yeah. Wow, the ideal would be having a huge mound, right? And then just putting it out on I mean, I would say in a pot scenario, again, we talked about the 1/3 to 2/3. I don't think there's ever too much, okay? And you're never going to have too much, unfortunately. I don't think we can compost as fast as we can what we need. But, you know, certainly like in the beginning, like this right now, you know, on my beds, I'm going to harvest compost, hopefully if my shoulder's better, next week. And I'm going to put some around all of my perennials to kind of give it that spring feed. And then whatever my compost is ready again in 6 to 8 weeks, I'm going to add it again. I certainly then at the end of the season will put it out for my perennials to give them a good feed before they go to sleep. Shrubs, same thing. I mean, I don't think there's a case of too much as long as it's not hot, right? But yeah, I don't have a real good answer on, because I just, and you know, unless you're buying bags and bags and bags of it, yeah. So yeah, so I mean that's the thing, because you're, you know, again in the beginning you mix it in with your soil and mix to start, so then it's a healthy ratio. And then just, yeah, put it on the top. Because again, if you don't want to dig too much, because then you're disturbing the roots structure and stuff, especially in a raised bed. So if you put it on top, and again, as often as you can do it, if you're harvesting it, put it down, because it's feeding it. It's absolutely feeding. And certainly in those container scenarios, you know, as you water, those nutrients are going to wash out at some point. So you can put it in as often. But, you know, I wouldn't do it any more than once a week, right? Once or twice a month, maybe. Yeah. Filters can go into. As long as you've got the browns to go with it. Yeah. Again, wow, I'd hate to see you on that much coffee. You don't want to see this, I do. Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. Take it, put it in your pile. Because again, you know, if you've got that 3-to-1 scenario, you know, three times as much browns as the greens, and the coffee is considered a green, it's a nitrogen. So as long as you have that 3 times amount of the other stuff, it's not, and it dissipates pretty quick, right? Yeah. It is for me. I am the decaf. You don't want to see this on caffeine. So no, it's not an issue. You know, your flavored coffees, maybe, you know, because there's different flavors on the bean. You know, I don't know. But again, you'd have to drink a lot of it to really make a significant change in your pile, right? I mean, we're just, you know, ground roots backyard people here. We're not doing it the large scheme. But you think of what everything that gets consumed in these larger composting facilities, it's not an issue. They add the heat to it. They're still coming out with a nice product that's a 5 to 7 pH, right? And, you know, obviously too, there's things like mushroom composting, all those different things that may have a different ratio, but that's because you want that for a specific plant. So, but in your backyard scenario, I would go for all you can. So.
We're using eggshells. Do you need to bake them? Do you throw any salmonella or?
So I just do a quick rinse, and And, you know, occasionally there will be a possum or a raccoon that finds them if I haven't crushed them. And in Texas, I would have it, and she would bring all the eggshells out if I hadn't crushed them, and she'd lick them clean. And of course, she didn't want the shell, and just leave them there for me. Take them, crush them, and put them in. But yeah, not an issue. Again, you'd have to have a lot to have that. But I do, as a safety, just do a quick rinse and brush it in, and then wash my hands. Anything else? Well, so you're hip and happening. So now it's about going out there and getting it done. I'm so glad you came tonight, especially in the nice weather, but I hope you learned something and add to your knowledge and spread the word, right? This is something we need to be doing, because as we know, in certain areas, even, you know, Fairport, I know, is having issues with their landfill, things like that. We need to figure out a way to solve this in our backyard. So go for it. Have fun.